In a mansion where rain lashed against the windows like tears, lived an autistic boy whose scream tore through the silence. Leo, trapped in a world misunderstood after his mother's death. His father, Richard, with empty eyes and trembling hands, had built empires but no bridges to his own son, until Eleanor, a simple household staff member, arrived with the wisdom of one who knows how to listen to the invisible. Between whispers and kaleidoscopes, she taught him that true love needs no words. Can these three broken hearts find a common language? If this story moves you, your like is more than a click. It's a hug for those who live in silence. And tell us, how do you think this bridge between different worlds will end? Your experience could illuminate other hearts searching for hope. The sticky heat of July embraced the wealthy East Coast suburb like a heavy blanket as the sun began to sink behind the grand colonial homes. On the highest ridge of the city, where stately houses dominated the landscape, the Vance estate shone brightly. Its white walls, adorned with ornate molding and shuttered windows, reflected the last lights of the day. The expansive gardens, replete with mature oak trees, manicured lawns, and fountains that murmured ancient secrets, were being meticulously prepared for what the local press claimed would be the party of the summer. Richard Vance was supervising every detail with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. At 45, he had built a real estate empire that stretched across the country. But it was here, in his home state, where his name resonated with the most power. Tall, distinguished, with black hair sprinkled with premature grey and dark eyes that rarely smiled, Richard projected an image of absolute success and control. He wore an immaculate grey suit despite the heat, and consulted his platinum watch every few minutes. The lights among the oak trees must be placed at exactly 5 feet intervals, he ordered one of the workers. And make sure the beverage temperature is perfect. The man nodded nervously and hurried away. Richard surveyed the garden, mentally calculating if everything would be ready to receive the city's elite. Tonight, he was celebrating the signing of a multi-million-dollar contract to build the most exclusive residential complex in the Mid-Atlantic, a project that would consolidate his position as the region's most influential developer. While the staff rushed back and forth following his instructions, Richard's gaze involuntarily drifted to the second-floor window. A small silhouette was dimly visible behind the white curtains. Leo, his 10-year-old son. Something tightened in Richard's face. The boy, with his large green eyes and perpetual silence, was the only element in his life he could not control, the only one who did not respond to his orders or his vision of the world. Leo had been diagnosed with autism at age 3, shortly after Miranda, his wife, died in a traffic accident. Since then, Richard had hired the best specialists in the country, visited clinics in New York and Boston, and tried innovative and traditional therapies, all without results he considered satisfactory. For a man accustomed to solving every problem with money and determination, Leo's condition was a constant reminder of his limitations. Richard looked away from the window and submerged himself back into the party preparations. He had ordered Leo to remain in his room during the event, attended to by one of the nurses who rotated weekly through the house. The boy did not tolerate crowds or loud noises well, and Richard could not afford any incident tonight. Inside the mansion, far from the bustle of the preparations, Eleanor Hayes was carefully folding a small blue shirt. At 28, she had been working as household staff at the Vance estate for only 6 months. She was a woman of medium height, with light brown hair pulled back in a simple braid and honey-colored eyes that transmitted a natural warmth. She wore the grey uniform Richard required of all staff, but there was something in her way of moving, in the softness of her gestures, that set her apart. Eleanor had not studied at prestigious universities, nor did she have degrees hanging on her wall. She came from a small town in rural Appalachia and had come to the city seeking a better future after her father's death. What she did possess was a special intuition, an innate ability to perceive what others missed. And from the first day she set foot in that mansion, she had seen something in Leo that all the specialists, with their diplomas and theories, seemed to have overlooked. "Do you like these paper boats, sweetie?" Eleanor asked, as she delicately placed 3 small origami figures on the boy's dresser. "I made them last night, thinking of you." Leo, sitting on the floor of his room, did not respond verbally or look up. His hands moved meticulously, sorting a collection of small metal cars by color and size. However, a slight change in the tension of his shoulders revealed to Eleanor that he had heard her. "Your dad is having a big party tonight," she continued while tidying up some toys. "There will be lots of people and noise, but you'll be safe up here. And tomorrow, if you like, we can go out to the garden early to see how the flowers wake up." Again, Leo did not respond conventionally, but his fingers, which had previously moved anxiously among the cars, adopted a more deliberate rhythm. Eleanor smiled. To her, those small changes in the boy's gestures were as eloquent as any word. Unlike the nurses and therapists who had paraded through the house, Eleanor did not try to fix Leo or force him to behave like other children. Instead, she had begun to learn his language, the way he moved his hands when he was anxious, how his eyes lit up at certain colors, his fascination with patterns and precision, small details that went unnoticed by others, but which, for her, composed a complex and beautiful language. A sudden boom in the garden, likely the technicians installing the sound system, made Leo cover his ears with both hands. His breathing quickened, and a low moan escaped his throat. Eleanor immediately approached, sitting next to him without touching him. "Breathe with me, Leo," she whispered, exaggerating her own inhalations and exhalations. "Like the ocean waves, remember? They come in and they go out. They come in and they go out." Slowly, the boy began to imitate her breathing rhythm. Eleanor pulled a small kaleidoscope she always carried with her from her uniform pocket, knowing the color patterns often calmed him. She offered it wordlessly, and Leo took it, turning it slowly toward the window light. The tension in his face began to dissolve as he observed the shifting figures. From the slightly ajar door, a figure watched them in silence. Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper who had served the Vances for over 20 years, contemplated the scene with a mixture of astonishment and suspicion. At 60, the woman, with her severe face and tight bun, had seen dozens of specialists and employees pass through promising miracles for the boy. None had lasted more than a few months. And now this untrained young woman, recently arrived from a lost town, seemed to connect with Leo in a way no one else had. "Mr. Vance has ordered Nurse Soto to take care of the boy tonight," Mrs. Davies announced in a dry voice, finally entering the room. "You are to assist with serving at the party, Eleanor." Eleanor nodded, although a flash of concern crossed her face. "Of course, Mrs. Davies. I was just finishing up tidying his things." The older woman narrowed her eyes, as if detecting a slight insubordination in such correct words. "Remember your place, girl," she said in a low but firm voice. "The master has hired the best professionals to look after his son. You are here to clean and serve, not to play therapist." Eleanor lowered her gaze, accepting the reprimand in silence. When the housekeeper retired, she turned back to Leo one last time. "I'll be back tomorrow, sweetie," she whispered, resisting the urge to stroke his hair. "Dream of paper boats sailing under the stars." The boy remained engrossed in his kaleidoscope, but as Eleanor headed toward the door, his green eyes lifted for an instant, following her. A gesture almost imperceptible to anyone, except for her. Meanwhile, downstairs, the guests began to arrive. Luxury cars pulled up to the main entrance, where a team of valets in white greeted them. Richard Vance stood in the marble foyer, shaking hands and receiving congratulations on his latest business success. Beside him, like an elegant shadow, was Alan Matthews, his business partner and friend since college. "You've exceeded all expectations, Richard," commented Alan, a slender man with designer glasses and a calculating smile. "This contract will put Vance Holdings on the international map." Richard nodded with contained satisfaction, but his eyes kept drifting toward the stairs every few minutes. No matter how much confidence he had in Nurse Soto, he couldn't shake a certain unease. Previous parties had ended with Leo agitated, despite all precautions. "Still worried about the boy?" Alan asked, catching his gaze. "You should seriously consider what we discussed, Richard. That boarding school in Switzerland has the best specialists in Europe. Leo would receive 24-hour attention, and you could focus on the business without distractions." Richard did not reply immediately. The idea of sending Leo away had crossed his mind more than once, especially on difficult days, when the boy's cries and meltdowns seemed endless. But something always stopped him. Perhaps the silent promise he had made to Miranda while holding her hand in the hospital during those final hours. "We'll talk about it later," he finally responded, before turning to greet an important contractor, who had just arrived. The night wore on. and the Vance estate filled with laughter, violin music, and the clinking of crystal glasses. The illuminated gardens seemed straight out of a fairy tale, with their fountains, statues, and hundreds of lights suspended among the oak trees. The city's elite mingled among waiters serving champagne and exquisite canapés. Politicians, businessmen, artists, all drawn by the magnetism of success and money. In the midst of that brilliant world, Eleanor moved with discretion. Dressed in a more formal black and white uniform than her usual grey one, she served drinks and collected empty glasses. She watched everything carefully, overhearing fragments of conversations about millions of dollars, future projects, and social gossip. A world that seemed to exist in another dimension, completely oblivious to the second-floor room where a boy sorted colored cars and looked at patterns through a kaleidoscope. However, as the party reached its peak and guests toasted Richard Vance's success, something in the atmosphere shifted. Perhaps it was a premonition, or perhaps simply the intuition that had always guided Eleanor. But suddenly, amid the celebratory noise, she perceived a discordant note. She lifted her gaze to the second-floor balcony, where Leo's room remained lit, and for an instant, she thought she saw a small silhouette moving behind the curtains, like a bird trapped in a gilded cage. At 11 o'clock that night, the party reached its climax when Richard Vance stepped onto the small stage, set up in the center of the garden. Spotlights illuminated his figure, highlighting his elegant posture and the self-assurance that emanated from his every gesture. The music stopped, and conversations faded as all the guests turned their attention to the host. "Distinguished friends," he began in a firm voice, holding a glass of champagne that shimmered under the lights. "It is an honor for me to welcome you to my home tonight, to celebrate. Not just a personal achievement, but a step forward for our beloved city." A polite round of applause rippled through the audience. Among the crowd, Eleanor had paused next to a column, an empty tray in her hands. From there, she could perfectly see Richard's face. That mask of confidence and control he never abandoned, at least not in public. The Harbour Crest Residences project will be the most innovative and exclusive residential complex in the Mid-Atlantic, Richard continued. 200 luxury homes combining classic architectural tradition with the most advanced technologies in sustainability, a project that will create over 1,000 direct jobs and position our city at the forefront of European real estate development. The applause intensified. Eleanor watched as the guests' faces reflected admiration, envy, or simple curiosity. Many, she knew, had come more for the social spectacle than for genuine interest in the project. Richard Vance's world was like that, a careful choreography where every gesture, every word, was calculated to impress. "I especially want to thank my team," Richard proceeded, gesturing to a group of men and women dressed in elegant dark suits. "Without their dedication and vision, this achievement would not have been possible. And of course all of you for joining me in this celebration that marks the beginning of a new era for Vance Holdings." As the speech continued, Eleanor felt a strange anxiety. Her eyes darted back to the second-floor window. The light was still on, but no silhouette was visible behind the curtains. A cold premonition settled in her chest like a stone. Without stopping to consider the inappropriateness of her action, she began to move discreetly among the guests, away from the garden and toward the house. Mrs. Davies intercepted her right at the entrance to the main foyer. "Where do you think you're going, Eleanor?" she asked sternly. "The guests still need attention in the garden." "Excuse me?" "Mrs. Davies," Eleanor replied, trying to keep a calm tone despite her growing concern. I think I should check on Leo. I have a feeling." The housekeeper looked at her with a mix of indignation and surprise. "Nurse Soto is with him. She is a qualified professional, not a simple domestic employee. Return immediately to your duties, or I will have to inform Mr. Vance." Eleanor hesitated. Her instinct told her something was wrong, but directly contradicting Mrs. Davies could cost her job. Yet the image of Leo alone in his room, possibly terrified by the increasing noise of the party, weighed more than any fear of reprisal. "I'm sorry, but I need to check if he's all right," she finally said, and before the housekeeper could stop her, she headed for the stairs. "This will have consequences, Eleanor," Mrs. Davies' voice echoed behind her. Eleanor rushed up the steps, her heart pounding against her chest. The second floor was immersed in a strange silence, barely interrupted by the muffled echoes of music and voices drifting up from the garden. She went to Leo's room and knocked softly on the door. There was no answer. "Leo! Nurse Soto!" she called again, a little louder this time. Receiving no reply, she turned the doorknob and entered. The room was empty. The colored cars remained meticulously arranged on the rug. The kaleidoscope rested on the bed, but neither Leo nor the nurse was there. The bathroom was also empty, as was the small study where the boy usually drew. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. Where could they be? She peered into the hallway just in time to see Nurse Soto emerging from a room at the end of the corridor, looking vexed. "Nurse Soto!" Eleanor called, hurrying toward her. "Where is Leo?" The nurse, a middle-aged woman with a perpetually tired face, looked at her with irritation. "I was just looking for him. I stepped out for a moment to take an urgent call from my daughter, and when I returned, the boy was gone. He must have slipped out. When I wasn't looking." Eleanor felt her blood run cold. Leo alone, somewhere in the mansion, with hundreds of guests and the pounding music of the party. "We have to find him quickly," she said, not hiding her urgency. "With all this noise and so many people, he could have a meltdown." The nurse seemed offended by the authoritative tone of someone she considered lower in rank. "I know perfectly well what could happen, Ms. Hayes. I don't need a domestic employee telling me how to do my job." Eleanor ignored the comment, too worried about Leo to dwell on susceptibilities. "You check this floor, please. I'll go down and search the main floor." Without waiting for a response, she headed back toward the stairs, silently praying to find the boy before the situation escalated. As she hurried down the steps, she heard a commotion coming from the garden, followed by a moment of silence and then gasps of astonishment. By the time she reached the foyer, she saw several guests had entered the house, excitedly commenting about something that had just occurred. Eleanor pushed her way through them until she reached the door leading to the garden, and what she saw made her heart stop for an instant. In the middle of the area, where Richard was giving his speech, Leo stood completely still. His hands covered his ears tightly, and his eyes, wide open, stared blankly, overwhelmed by the lights, the people, and the noise. A few feet from him, Richard had interrupted his speech and was looking at his son with a mixture of disbelief and horror. The guests formed a circle around the boy, some with expressions of curiosity, others with obvious discomfort. "What is that child doing here?" she heard someone ask. "It's Richard's son, the one with issues," another voice replied in a whisper that was clearly audible in the sudden silence. Leo began to rock slightly, a movement Eleanor knew well. It was his way of calming himself when the outside world became too overwhelming. His lips were moving, likely reciting silently some sequence of numbers or words that provided him comfort. Richard quickly recovered from the initial shock and approached his son with measured but tense steps. "Leo," he said loudly, as if volume could penetrate the invisible barrier separating the boy from the world. "Leo, go back to your room right now." The boy showed no sign of hearing him. His rocking became more pronounced, and a low wail began to escape his throat. Eleanor knew what would happen next if no one intervened. A full-blown meltdown with screaming and possibly self-injury. Without considering the consequences, she rushed into the center of the garden, passing Richard, who was unsuccessfully trying to get his son to react. "Leo is having one of his tantrums," she heard Alan Matthews say, with a tone that mixed second-hand embarrassment and a certain mockery. "Perhaps we should continue the party in the main parlor while they take care of the incident." The nervous giggles of some guests were like needles in Eleanor's ears. She knelt in front of Leo, placing herself in his line of sight, but without touching him. She knew that in that state, any unsolicited physical contact could worsen the situation. "Leo," she whispered, using a soft melodic tone that contrasted with the tense atmosphere. "It's Eleanor. I'm here with you. Look at me, sweetie. Just look at me." The boy's green eyes, previously lost in the void, seemed to focus on her face for an instant. The rocking continued, but the wail diminished slightly. "Breathe with me," she continued, exaggerating her inhalations and exhalations as she did during his calm moments. "Like the ocean waves, remember? They come in and they go out. They come in and they go out." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Leo began to synchronize his breathing with hers. Eleanor pulled out the small kaleidoscope she always carried and held it up to the boy, allowing the spotlight to filter through the toy, creating luminous patterns she knew he found comforting. Richard watched the scene with a mixture of astonishment and indignation. His son, who usually ignored the instructions of the best specialists, seemed to be responding to the simple words of a household employee. Moreover, the entire city elite was witnessing what he had always tried to hide, the reality of having a different son, a son who did not fit into the perfect world he had built. "What do you think you're doing?" he finally asked, addressing Eleanor in a sharp tone. "Nurse Soto handles these episodes. This is not your business." Eleanor did not take her eyes off Leo, aware that any interruption in the established connection could cause a setback. "With all due respect, sir," she replied in a low but firm voice, "the nurse is not here right now and Leo needs immediate help. I am only doing what I know works to calm him." "What you know?" Richard's voice dropped to a dangerously low pitch. "What can a simple domestic employee know about treating my son? We have consulted with the best specialists in Europe, spent fortunes on therapy, and now you, with no training, come here to tell us what works." The guests watched the exchange with morbid fascination. For many, this unexpected drama was more entertaining than any speech about real estate projects. "I'm not saying I know more than the specialists, sir," Eleanor replied, maintaining her calm. "I only know what I have observed over these months." Leo responds, "Better when he feels understood, not when he is treated as a problem to be solved." Richard's expression hardened. He clearly considered Eleanor's intervention not only insubordination, but also a challenge to his authority as a father. "You're fired," he decreed, with a coldness that made several guests hold their breath. "Pack your things tomorrow, and now step aside and let the professionals take care of my son." At that precise moment, as if fate wanted to prove a point, Leo extended his small hand and took the kaleidoscope from Eleanor's fingers. The wail had completely ceased and his breathing had normalized. His eyes remained fixed on the light patterns, but the tension in his body had visibly diminished. Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. She knew her dismissal meant she could no longer help Leo, that she would probably never see him again. But she also knew that confronting Richard Vance meant the end of any possibility of respectable employment in this town. It was her, word against that of one of the most powerful men in the city. Even so, she could not help but say, "Leo doesn't need more therapists or nurses who see him as a clinical case, sir. He needs someone who sees him for what he is, a wonderful boy who simply experiences the world differently." An absolute silence followed her words. The violinists had stopped playing, the waiters remained motionless with their trays, and even the wind seemed to have stilled among the oak trees. In the midst of that expectant silence, something happened that no one could have predicted. Leo, still holding the kaleidoscope with one hand, extended the other and took Eleanor's hand, lacing his small fingers with hers. It was the first time the boy had initiated physical contact with anyone since his mother's death. To any casual observer, it might seem a simple gesture, but for Richard Vance, who had spent years trying to establish a connection with his son, it was like witnessing an impossibility come true. His face, normally a mask of control, now revealed a storm of contradictory emotions, and it was at that precise moment, with Leo clinging to Eleanor's hand under the astonished gaze of the city's elite, that the first fireworks exploded in the night sky, illuminating the garden with flashes of blue and silver. A spectacle Richard had planned as the triumphant culmination of his celebration, but which now served as a backdrop for something far more significant, the beginning of a change none of the attendees could anticipate. Dawn found Eleanor packing her few belongings into a small, worn suitcase. Her room, a modest space in the service wing of the Vance estate, was clean and tidy, as if it had never been occupied. Only a vase with freshly cut wildflowers on the dresser betrayed her presence. She had slept little, reliving the events of the previous night over and over. The image of Leo taking her hand in front of everyone, Richard's distressed face, the surprised looks of the guests, and then the silence. A silence that followed the burst of fireworks, when Mrs. Davies, following Richard's orders, had discreetly escorted her to her room, instructing her to leave the property first thing in the morning. Eleanor closed the suitcase with a sigh. She did not regret intervening. She would have done it 1,000 times over if necessary. The only thing that hurt was thinking of Leo, alone again, surrounded by professionals who viewed his condition as a problem, not as a different way of being. Who would offer him kaleidoscopes when the world was too loud? Who would breathe with him like the ocean waves? A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Opening it, she found Marisol, one of the younger maids, who handed her a white envelope. "Mrs. Davies says this is your severance," the young woman explained sadly, "and that Mr. Vance expects you to leave the property before 8. Eleanor took the envelope, thanking her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Marisol hesitated for a moment before adding quietly, "Last night, what you did for the boy, it was very brave." Before Eleanor could reply, the young maid quickly walked away down the hall. It was not prudent to show sympathy for someone who had fallen out of favor with the master of the house. Eleanor put the envelope away without opening it and picked up her suitcase. She took one last look at the room that had been her home for the past 6 months, and with a lump in her throat, closed the door behind her. She walked down the long service corridor, hoping to leave the mansion without encountering anyone else, especially Richard Vance. She didn't trust herself to remain composed if forced to face him again. However, upon reaching the main foyer, she stopped short. Sitting in one of the elegant leather armchairs, staring at the door she had just entered through, was Richard. He wore the same suit from the night before, though now wrinkled, and his face showed evident signs of a sleepless night. Next to him, on a small table, rested an untouched cup of coffee. The silence between them stretched like a thin layer of ice. Eleanor, her suitcase firmly gripped, waited for him to speak first, maintaining a serene gaze despite the inner turmoil. "Nurse Soto submitted her resignation this morning," Richard finally said, his voice neutral. "Apparently she considers her negligence in leaving Leo alone unforgivable and prefers to leave before being dismissed." Eleanor nodded slightly, unsure how to respond. She felt no satisfaction at the nurse's resignation. On the contrary, it meant one less person to care for Leo. "I spent the night reflecting," Richard continued, rising from the armchair with stiff movements that betrayed his fatigue. "About my son, about the specialists who have paraded through this house for years, and about what I witnessed last night." He walked toward one of the windows overlooking the garden, now illuminated by the soft golden light of dawn. The remnants of the party, tables with white linens, scattered chairs, some forgotten glasses, offered a melancholic sight under the morning dew. "In 7 years," Richard continued, without turning to look at her, "no doctor, therapist, or psychologist has managed to get Leo to voluntarily take their hand. Not even me," his voice broke slightly. "Not even I, his father, have achieved that connection." Eleanor remained silent, sensing that Richard needed to express something important, something he had perhaps kept locked up for too long. "Last night you said that Leo doesn't need to be treated as a clinical case, but as a child who experiences the world differently." He finally turned to her, his face a mixture of confusion and vulnerability. "What exactly does that mean? All the specialists talk about therapies, treatments, interventions, as if there was something broken to fix." The question hung between them, loaded with a weight that went beyond simple professional curiosity. It was the question of a father lost in a labyrinth of diagnoses and frustrated expectations. Eleanor put her suitcase down and took a deep breath before answering. "Mr. Vance, over these months I've observed that Leo is not broken," Eleanor replied in a serene but firm voice. "He simply perceives the world differently. Where we hear a normal conversation, he hears overwhelming noise. Where we see colors, he sees patterns and intensities. He doesn't need fixing, he needs to be understood." Richard stared at her intently, as if trying to determine if there was truth or simple naivety in her words. "And how do you explain last night? How did you manage to calm him down when even the best specialists fail?" "By observing, sir, by learning his language instead of forcing him to learn ours." Eleanor paused. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just showed him that I respected the way he is, that I wasn't trying to change him." A heavy silence settled between them. Richard ran a hand over his tired face, and for the first time Eleanor saw the man behind the facade of the ruthless businessman, an overwhelmed father, a widower who had lost his way. "Don't go," he finally said, in a voice she barely recognized as his own. I need to understand what you see in my son that all the rest of us have overlooked." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Of all the possibilities she had imagined for this morning, this was the most unexpected. "Are you asking me to stay after last night?" "I'm asking you to help my son," Richard replied with unusual humility, "as his personal caregiver, not as household staff." Before Eleanor could reply, a noise on the main staircase drew the attention of both. Leo was coming down the steps slowly, still in his pajamas, the kaleidoscope firmly grasped in his right hand. Seeing Eleanor, he paused, observing her with an intensity unusual for him. "Good morning, sweetie." Eleanor greeted him with a smile, momentarily forgetting the conversation with Richard. "Did you sleep well?" Leo did not respond verbally, but his eyes did not leave her as he finished descending the stairs. When he reached the foyer, he walked directly toward Eleanor and, to the surprise of both adults, held out the kaleidoscope to her. "I think that's your answer," Richard murmured, watching the silent exchange between his son and the woman he had intended to fire just hours ago. "Leo wants you to stay." Eleanor looked at the kaleidoscope in her hands, then at Leo and finally at Richard. Her decision was already made before she even spoke the words, "I will stay, sir," for Leo. In the following weeks, life at the Vance estate underwent a subtle but profound transformation. Eleanor, now settled in a larger, brighter room near Leo's, had officially taken on the role of the boy's personal caregiver. At her request, Richard had dismissed the army of therapists and specialists who marched through the house daily, keeping only Dr. Fernandez, a child neuropsychiatrist who seemed genuinely interested in Leo's well-being beyond diagnoses and labels. Eleanor's first action was to reorganize Leo's room, removing the medical equipment and behavior charts that made him feel like a patient. In their place, she created a sensory space where the boy could regulate his emotions, soft lights, diverse textures, ambient music, and a quiet corner with cushions where he could retreat when the outside world became too intense. Richard observed these changes with a mixture of skepticism and hope. Every morning before heading to his office, he stopped by Leo's room to see him, even if only for a few minutes. He no longer tried to force conversations or physical contact. He was simply present, following Eleanor's advice. First, learn to be present in his silence. One late August afternoon, while Eleanor and Leo were exploring the garden looking for insects for a small collection they had started, Richard returned early from work. From the terrace, he watched his son kneeling by a rosebush, completely absorbed in contemplating a ladybug walking on a leaf. Eleanor, sitting beside him, occasionally pointed to something, but their interaction was predominantly silent, respectful of the boy's fascination. "It's the first time in years I've seen him so peaceful," Richard commented when Eleanor came up to the terrace after putting Leo to bed. "He's finding his place in the world, in his own way," she replied, accepting the glass of lemonade he offered her. "Leo has extraordinary abilities, Mr. Vance. His attention to detail, his visual memory, his sensitivity. They are not defects, they are gifts." Richard looked at her with a mix of admiration and uncertainty. "Eleanor, may I ask you something personal?" When she nodded, he continued, "Why do you care so much about my son? Most people would have left after what happened at the party." Eleanor contemplated the garden bathed in the golden light of sunset before replying. "My younger brother had autism," she finally said. "No one understood him, not even my parents. They treated him as if he was sick, like a problem to be solved. He died in an accident when he was 12, without anyone having truly tried to know him." A silence charged with meaning settled between them. "I'm sorry," Richard murmured, understanding for the first time the depth of Eleanor's commitment to Leo. "When I met your son, I saw someone wonderful trapped in a world that doesn't understand him. I don't want what happened to my brother to happen again. I don't want Leo to grow up thinking there's something wrong with him." That night, as Richard stared at the ceiling of his room, unable to sleep, he made a decision. It was time to rethink not only his relationship with Leo, but the entire structure of his life. The business empire he had built, the parties, the social status. None of it mattered if he couldn't connect with his own son. Alan. Matthews pounded the boardroom table with barely contained frustration. "Have you lost your mind, Richard? Delaying the Harbour Crest Residences project indefinitely? The investors will eat us alive." Richard remained unperturbed, reviewing the new schedule he had drawn up over the past month. "I'm not cancelling anything, Alan. I'm just restructuring my priorities. The project will move forward, but at a pace that allows me to be more present for Leo." Alan looked at him as if he had uttered a blasphemy. All this for a fit of paternal sentimentality. His voice dripped with disbelief. "Richard, you have an entire staff of people to care for the boy. That domestic employee you've now made a nanny." specialized caregiver, Richard corrected in a cold voice, and her name is Eleanor. Whatever. She can handle Leo while you focus on what really matters. Vance Holdings is about to make the international leap we always dreamed of. Richard observed his partner with a newfound clarity. For years he had shared Alan's vision. Success, recognition, constant expansion. Now those ambitions seemed empty if they meant remaining a stranger to his own son. What really matters, Alan, is that I have a 10-year-old son who barely knows me, he replied firmly. And I intend to fix that. The meeting ended in an impasse, with Alan grimly warning that the investors wouldn't wait forever. Richard knew his decision would have consequences, but for the first time in years, he felt he was following the right path. September brought the return to the school routine, an annual challenge that had always been traumatic for Leo. Previous attempts to integrate him into conventional schools had failed, and Richard had ended up hiring private tutors who taught lessons at home, with irregular results. Leo needs social interaction, but in an environment that respects his needs, Eleanor explained during one of their evening conversations, which had become habitual. I've researched some options. She told him about the Haven Center, a small school specializing in neurodivergent children that offered an adapted program and a respectful approach. It's far less prestigious than the schools you've considered before, Eleanor admitted, but I believe Leo would flourish there. To Eleanor's surprise, Richard did not resist the idea. The next day, both visited the center, a modest but bright building on the outskirts of the city. The director, Sophia Linares, received them with unpretentious warmth, explaining her educational philosophy based on each child's individual strengths, not their challenges. Here we don't try to make children fit a predetermined mold, she explained as she showed them the facilities. We adapt the teaching to their way of learning. Richard observed the children in various activities, some working silently, others in small groups, each at their own pace and in their own way. It was a radically different approach to the structured, competitive education he had valued all his life. And do they really learn this way, he asked, unable to hide a certain skepticism. Sophia smiled. Some of our graduates are now in top universities, Mr. Vance, not because we forced them, but because they discovered their passion by being respected as individuals. A week later, Leo began attending the Haven Center. The first few days were difficult. The change in routine generated anxiety, and Eleanor had to stay with him in the classroom. But gradually the boy began to adapt. His teacher, a young man named Miguel with infinite patience, discovered Leo's interest in mathematical patterns and used it as a bridge to other areas of learning. Every afternoon, Richard adjusted his schedule to personally pick up Leo. Initially, these car rides were silent, but over time and following Eleanor's advice, Richard learned to share that silence without anxiety, respecting his son's mental space. Occasionally, Leo would point out something that caught his attention through the window, a particular bird, a cloud with an interesting shape, and Richard would respond with simple observations, without pressure. Small bridges were being built between them, invisible but real. In mid-October, Eleanor made a discovery that would change the course of their lives. While organizing some of Leo's belongings, she found a forgotten box at the back of his closet. It contained personal items belonging to Miranda, Richard's late wife, photographs, letters, a diary, and several notebooks. Among them, a blue notebook caught her attention. Opening it, she found pages filled with detailed observations about Leo from his birth until age 3, written in Miranda's elegant handwriting. They were not simple notes from a first-time mother, but meticulous observations about behavior patterns, responses to stimuli, and sensory preferences. With growing surprise, Eleanor realized that Miranda had recognized the signs of autism in her son very early, on long before the official diagnosis. But even more impactful was discovering that Miranda did not view these signs as a problem to be solved, but as precious characteristics of her son. Leo sees the world through a different prism, Miranda had written in one of the last entries, just weeks before her death. He doesn't need to be changed or fixed. He needs to be understood. My greatest fear is that, if something happens to me, the world will try to mold him in its image, destroying the unique beauty of his mind. With a heavy heart, Eleanor understood that she had been following unknowingly the path Miranda had begun. Leo's mother had seen in her son what Eleanor now saw, an extraordinary being who experienced the world differently, not inferiorly. That night when Richard returned from work, Eleanor showed him the notebook. She watched him pale as he turned the pages, recognizing his wife's writing, absorbing words he had ignored for years. "She knew," he finally murmured, his voice cracking. "Miranda understood Leo much better than I did." "She left you a map, sir," Eleanor replied softly. "Perhaps now is the time to follow it." Richard spent the entire night reading Miranda's notebooks, rediscovering his wife through her words and, by extension, his son. At dawn, when Eleanor found him asleep in his study with the blue notebook on his chest, she knew something fundamental had changed in him. Inspired by Miranda's notes and guided by Eleanor, Richard began to actively immerse himself in Leo's world, no longer as a distant observer or a father expecting normalcy, but as someone willing to learn a new language, the silent language of his son. Together, they transformed an empty room in the mansion into a sensory space where Leo could explore textures, lights, sounds, and colors in a safe environment. Richard, who had always delegated such projects to others, became personally involved, researching, designing, and even building some elements with his own hands. Eleanor watched this change with a mixture of satisfaction and a certain melancholy. The connection between father and son flourished daily, and although this was precisely what she had hoped to achieve, she felt an inevitable pang at the thought that her presence would become less and less necessary. One Saturday morning, as Leo and Richard were jointly exploring new music software that translated mathematical patterns into melodies, Mrs. Davies entered the room with a grave expression. "Sir Alan Matthews is here. He says it's urgent." Richard frowned. In recent weeks, his relationship with Alan had deteriorated considerably, with increasingly tense arguments about the company's direction. "Tell him I'm busy with my son." "I already told him, sir," the housekeeper replied uncomfortably. "He insists it's about the Harbour Crest Residences project, something about investors pulling out." Richard looked at Leo, who remained engrossed in the musical patterns, oblivious to the conversation. Eleanor, sensing his dilemma, intervened. "Go ahead, we'll continue here. Leo is really enjoying this." Reluctantly, Richard headed to his study, where Alan awaited him with a triumphant expression and a folder of documents. "The investors have tired of waiting, Richard," he announced without preamble. "Either you resume the project with the dedication it requires, or they will seek another partner. And I understand that Herrera Construction has already presented them with an alternative proposal." Richard took the documents his partner offered, reviewing them with an impassive expression. Indeed, the investor consortium was threatening to withdraw funding if the project did not move forward at the originally agreed pace. "I've sacrificed too much for this company," Alan continued. "I won't let you ruin it over a family whim." The word whim ignited something in Richard. He looked up from the documents, studying the man he had considered his friend for 2 decades. For the first time, he clearly saw the unbridled ambition, the calculating coldness, the complete absence of empathy that had always been there, but which he had interpreted as necessary qualities for success. "A whim, Alan?" he responded in a controlled voice. "Is that how you define my decision to be a father to my son?" Alan made a dismissive gesture. "We all have family responsibilities, Richard, but we don't neglect business because of them, especially when so much is at stake. Do you know what I've discovered these past weeks?" Richard stood up, rounding the desk to face his partner directly. "That I spent 7 years building buildings while ignoring the foundation of my own family. That ends now." "What exactly are you saying?" Alan's expression hardened. "That if I have to choose between Harbour Crest Residences and my son, the decision is made. Find another partner to lead the project, Alan. I have more important priorities." Incredulity gave way to fury on Alan's face. "You'll regret this, Richard. When your reputation is in shambles and your stock is worthless, you'll remember this moment." "That's possible," Richard conceded, with surprising serenity. "But for the first time in years, I'll be able to look myself in the mirror without shame." When Alan left, slamming the door shut, Richard remained motionless in his study, processing the magnitude of his decision. He had just jeopardized his entire business empire, his status, his financial security, and yet he felt an inner peace he hadn't experienced in years. He returned to the sensory room, where Leo had created a particularly beautiful musical sequence. Eleanor watched Richard attentively, noticing the tension in his shoulders, but also a certain lightness in his expression. "Everything all right?" she asked softly. "Surprisingly, yes," Richard replied, sitting down next to his son. "For the first time in a long time, I think everything is exactly as it should be." The consequences of Richard's decision were not long in coming. Like a house of cards, elements of his carefully constructed empire began to totter. Alan, furious at what he considered a betrayal, used his influence to sow doubts among investors and business partners. Rumors about Richard's mental stability and the financial viability of Vance Holdings began to circulate in business circles. In just weeks, several lines of credit were cancelled, 2 smaller projects were suspended, and the company's stock value fell by 15%. The financial press, which previously praised Richard's business genius, now speculated about his imminent downfall. One rainy November afternoon, Richard returned home drenched and visibly exhausted after a tense meeting with the board of directors. Eleanor was waiting for him in the foyer with a towel and a worried expression. "The board wants my resignation," Richard announced as he dried his face. "They believe I've lost my judgment and am driving the company to ruin." "I'm so sorry," Eleanor replied, genuinely distressed. "It was never my intention to cause problems in your work." Richard looked at her in surprise. "Your intention? Eleanor, none of this is your fault. On the contrary, you have opened our eyes, Leo's and mine." He paused as if carefully considering his next words. "For the first time, I am making decisions based on what truly matters, not on appearances or outside expectations. But your company, everything you've built—" "I can rebuild a company," he interrupted gently. "I cannot recover the lost years with my son." That night, after putting Leo to bed, Eleanor went to her room with a heavy heart. Richard's transformation was admirable, but she couldn't help feeling responsible for the difficulties he faced. Had she been selfish in insisting so much on changing the family dynamic? Did she have the right to intervene in their lives that way? Her reflections were interrupted by a soft knock on her door. Opening it, she found Richard holding an old folder. "Excuse the hour," he apologized, "but I wanted to show you something." Eleanor invited him in, intrigued. Richard opened the folder, revealing architectural blueprints and conceptual sketches. "This was Miranda's original project for our home," he explained. "Before Leo was born, we dreamed of creating a different space, a place that combined beauty and functionality with a purpose beyond simple luxury." Eleanor examined the designs with growing astonishment. Miranda's vision was revolutionary, an integrated residential and educational complex where families with neurodivergent children could live and learn in an environment adapted to their needs. "It's extraordinary," Eleanor murmured. "Why did you never proceed with it?" Richard sighed, a sound laden with regret. "Because I didn't understand it then. It seemed like an idealistic project without commercial viability." He paused. "After she died, I put these plans away and focused on building structures that generated profit, not communities that created human value." "And now," Eleanor asked, sensing a change in his tone, "now I believe I've found the purpose I've been looking for." Richard's eyes shone with renewed determination. "I'm going to realize Miranda's dream, Eleanor. I'm going to transform Vance Holdings into something that truly makes a difference." Richard's plan was audacious: to convert the failed Harbour Crest Residences project into a residential and educational complex inspired by Miranda's original vision. A space where families with neurodivergent children could find not only homes adapted to their needs, but also an integrated educational center, therapeutic areas, community spaces, and job opportunities. "It will be the first complex of its kind in the nation," Richard explained to a small group of potential investors gathered in his study. "A model of inclusion and sustainability that could be replicated in other cities." Among those present was Mr. James Murray, a businessman whose grandson had recently been diagnosed with autism. Eleanor, invited by Richard to explain the practical aspects of the project, observed how the man's eyes lit up as he heard the details of the sensory design and specific adaptations. "And would this really work?" Murray asked, addressing Eleanor. "Wouldn't it be better for these children to be integrated into conventional environments?" Eleanor held his gaze serenely. "True inclusion is not about forcing someone to fit into a system not designed for them, Mr. Murray. It's about creating spaces where everyone can participate fully, by being who they are. The meeting concluded with cautious optimism. James Murray and 2 other investors showed genuine interest in the project, though they warned they needed time to study its financial viability. When the last visitors left, Richard and Eleanor remained in the study, surrounded by blueprints and models. "You were brilliant," Richard commented, pouring himself a glass of water. "Your passion for this is contagious." Eleanor smiled, surprised by the compliment. "It's easy to be passionate when you believe in something, and I truly believe in this project, Mr. Vance." Richard looked at her intently. "After everything we've been through these months, I think you could call me Richard." A silence charged with meaning settled between them. Eleanor was suddenly conscious of the transformation their relationship had undergone from the initial formality between employer and employee to this complicity based on a shared purpose. "Richard," she finally said, testing how his name sounded, "I think this project could change many lives." "It has already changed mine," he replied sincerely. "And I want you to be part of it, Eleanor, not as an employee but as a partner." The proposal took her completely by surprise. "A partner? But I don't have business training or capital to invest." "You have something much more valuable. Genuine understanding of the needs we are trying to address." Richard handed her a document. "I've drafted a proposal, leading the educational and therapeutic area, designing programs, training staff, doing what you do naturally, but on a larger scale." Eleanor took the document with slightly trembling hands. It was an opportunity she never could have imagined, a path to expand what she had discovered with Leo to other children and families. "I need time to think about it," she finally replied. "Of course," Richard nodded. "It's an important decision." That night, Eleanor walked through the mansion's gardens under a starry sky, weighing the proposal. The project resonated deeply with her values and aspirations, but it also represented a leap into the unknown. Furthermore, it implied a permanence in the Vances' lives that would transcend her initial role as Leo's caregiver. And this last thought provoked complex emotions she wasn't yet ready to examine. As the project took shape, news spread through business and social circles, generating diverse reactions. To Richard's surprise, many were positive. Families in situations similar to his began contacting him, sharing their experiences and offering their support. Professionals in education and therapy showed interest in collaborating. Even some former skeptics began to see potential in the idea, not only as a philanthropic initiative, but as an innovative business model addressing a real need unmet by the traditional real estate market. One afternoon, while Richard and Eleanor were reviewing the latest modifications to the blueprints, Leo silently entered the study. He held a drawing in his hands, which was unusual, as he rarely shared his artistic creations. "What do you have there, Leo?" his father asked softly. The boy did not respond, but approached the table and carefully placed the drawing over the blueprints. Eleanor and Richard exchanged a surprised look before examining the artwork. It was a meticulous and detailed drawing of what appeared to be the future residential complex, but with additional elements: small bridges connecting the buildings, green areas with specific shapes, color patterns on the facades, and most surprisingly, small human figures interacting in the spaces, some clearly depicted with typical autistic behaviors. "It's extraordinary," Eleanor murmured, recognizing the precision and meaning of each element. "Leo has perfectly understood the project's purpose." Richard looked at the drawing with moist eyes, overwhelmed not only by the talent revealed, but by the connection his son had established with a project that, in essence, had begun because of him. "Would you like us to include your ideas, Leo?" he asked, looking directly at his son. "You're the expert here. You know better than anyone what would work." To the astonishment of both adults, Leo nodded slightly, a deliberate gesture of communication he rarely offered. From that moment, Leo became a silent but fundamental collaborator on the project. His drawings and visual suggestions provided perspectives no conventional architect or designer would have considered. Richard modified the work dynamic to include his son, adapting meetings and presentations to be accessible to him. This unexpected turn did not go unnoticed by the local media. A journalist from the City Business Journal, intrigued by rumors about Vance Holdings' new focus, requested an interview with Richard. Initially reluctant to expose his personal life, Richard finally agreed to the interview on one condition: that the focus be on the project and its social impact, not sensationalism about his son. The resulting article, titled "From Builders of Buildings to Builders of Bridges," had an unexpected impact. The story of how a businessman had completely reoriented his business vision, inspired by his son's needs, resonated with many families. The journalist had sensitively captured the essence of the project. It was not about charity, but about reimagining spaces that would allow neurodivergent people to fully develop their potential. Alan Matthews read the article with increasing irritation. Richard's renewed image as a humanitarian visionary directly contradicted the narrative he had been promoting about his former partner, that of a man destabilized by family problems, incapable of leading a successful company. "This is simple emotional fluff," he snapped, throwing the newspaper onto his desk. "It doesn't change the fact that he abandoned promising projects for an unrealizable dream." But internally, Alan was beginning to worry. The investors who had initially backed his position were now showing curiosity about Richard's new direction. Some had even requested meetings to learn more details about the innovative residential complex. The seed of a vengeful idea began to germinate in his mind. The official presentation of the Silent Bridges Initiative project was scheduled for early December at City Hall. Richard had secured preliminary support from the local government, interested in positioning the city as a pioneer in inclusive architecture. 2 days before the event, while Eleanor was helping Leo prepare for his participation, he would present some of his conceptual drawings in a small adjacent exhibit. Richard received an urgent call from his lawyer. "Someone has leaked confidential documentation to the press," he explained in a tense voice. "Leo's medical reports, psychological evaluations, even private photos of difficult episodes. The Daily Financial Review plans to publish an article tomorrow questioning your capacity to lead this project when you can't even handle your own son's condition." Richard felt the ground open beneath him. Those documents were stored in his personal study, accessible only to a very small circle of people. "Alan," he muttered, the realization hitting him with absolute certainty. Only he would have the access and motivation. The lawyer confirmed his suspicion. The leak had been made by someone with privileged access to company files, and the digital signature on several documents corresponded to Alan's account. "We can file a lawsuit for breach of confidentiality," the lawyer suggested, but the media damage would already be done. Richard hung up the phone, steeped in a cold fury he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't for himself, but for Leo. His son, who was finally beginning to open up to the world, would now be exposed and analyzed as a case in public media. When he shared the situation with Eleanor, she reacted with surprising calm. "There's always the option of getting ahead of them," she suggested, after a moment's reflection. "Telling our own story before they build a distorted narrative." "What exactly do you mean?" "To be honest, Richard, about Leo's autism, about your learning process as a father, about the true purpose of the project. No sensationalism or victimhood, just the truth." The proposal was risky. It meant exposing vulnerabilities Richard had always jealously guarded, but it also represented an opportunity to transform an attack into a powerful message. That same night, Richard contacted Laura Quintero, a respected journalist specializing in social issues. He offered her an exclusive interview with one condition: that Leo be treated with dignity, not as an object of pity or curiosity. The City Hall auditorium was completely full. Local authorities, businessmen, families with neurodivergent children, education and health professionals, and numerous media outlets had gathered for the official presentation of the Silent Bridges Initiative project. Richard, dressed in a sober but elegant suit, waited backstage. Beside him, Leo meticulously adjusted the alignment of the drawings he would present, while Eleanor reviewed her notes for the educational section of the presentation. "Alan's here," reported James Murray, now one of the project's main investors. In the front row with some reporters from the Daily Financial Review. Richard nodded, unsurprised. The interview with Laura Quintero had been published that very morning, stealing the impact from the leak Alan had orchestrated. Instead of the expected sensationalism, the story presented was one of personal and corporate transformation, of a father learning to see the world through his son's eyes and discovering in the process an opportunity to create genuine social value. "Perfect," Richard replied. "I'm glad he can witness this firsthand." When he finally stepped onto the stage, accompanied by Eleanor and, to the surprise of the audience, by Leo, An expectant silence filled the hall. Richard briefly looked at Alan, seated with a tense expression among journalists, who clearly had expected a different scandal than the one now unfolding before them. "Distinguished authorities, esteemed guests," Richard began, "today I present to you not just an architectural project, but a different vision of what it means to build truly inclusive spaces." With serene eloquence, he explained the fundamentals of the residential complex, its technical innovations, and its focus on the real needs of neurodivergent families. But it was when he began to speak about the inspiration behind the project that his voice took on a palpable emotion. "For years, I viewed my son's condition as a problem to be solved, an obstacle to overcome," he admitted, under the attentive gaze of the auditorium. "I hired specialists, sought treatments, tried to make Leo adapt to a world designed for neurotypical people. It never occurred to me that perhaps the problem was not with him, but with my inability to understand and value his different way of experiencing reality." A murmur swept through the room. In the front row, Alan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It was thanks to Eleanor Hayes," Richard continued, gesturing to the woman standing calmly beside him, "that I began to see the situation from a new perspective, not as a businessman looking for efficient solutions, but as a father learning to truly know his son." Eleanor took over, explaining with passion and practical knowledge the educational and therapeutic aspects of the project. Her presentation, devoid of technical jargon but brimming with real understanding, captured the audience's absolute attention. And then came the moment no one expected. Leo, with deliberate and precise movements, began to display his drawings on a special screen while Richard explained the meaning of each element. The boy whom many had years earlier seen as a problem during that fateful party was now presented as a valuable collaborator, a designer with a unique and invaluable perspective. "The true experts in neurodiversity," Richard concluded, "are neurodivergent people themselves. Our job is not to fix them or force them to fit in, but to create spaces where they can flourish by being exactly who they are." The applause that followed was deafening. Journalists who had come expecting a scandal were now covering a story of corporate and family renewal. Families with neurodivergent children approached Richard and Eleanor with tears in their eyes, thanking them for the visibility and dignity the project offered. Alan, unable to bear any more, left the hall before the presentation concluded. His attempt to discredit Richard had transformed into a platform that further elevated his image and purpose. Vengeance had become a catalyst for success. 6 months later, the first phase of the Silent Bridges Initiative complex was in full construction. What had begun as a conversion of the Harbour Crest Residences project had expanded to include an innovative educational centre, specialised therapeutic areas, and housing designed with principles of universal accessibility. Richard had completely reorganised Vance Holdings, focusing the company on inclusive and sustainable architecture. To the surprise of skeptics, the new direction had proven not only socially valuable, but also commercially successful. Other developers were beginning to show interest in replicating aspects of the model in different cities. Alan Matthews had disappeared from the business scene after an ethics scandal related to the confidential document leak. His attempt to discredit Richard had ended up discrediting himself when evidence of his involvement became public. One spring afternoon, Richard found Eleanor and Leo in the mansion's garden. The boy had developed an interest in photography, capturing natural patterns that others would overlook with mathematical precision. Eleanor guided him without directing him, offering suggestions but always respecting his unique vision. "I was looking for you," Richard said, approaching Eleanor as Leo photographed a sequence of fallen leaves. "The educational centre needs a director." Eleanor smiled, anticipating what was coming next. "And do you have a candidate in mind?" "The person who taught me that true education is not about moulding, but about understanding," he replied, holding her gaze. "You, Eleanor." She looked at Leo for a moment, reflecting on the extraordinary journey they had shared. "A year ago, I was just a domestic employee with no specialized training," she commented. "Some would say I'm not qualified. I would say you have the only truly important qualification, the ability to see every person as a complete and valuable individual, not as a diagnosis or a label." Eleanor felt a cycle completing. She had come to that mansion simply seeking a job, never imagining she would find a purpose that honored her brother's memory and would transform so many lives, including her own. "I accept," she finally replied, "with one condition, which is that Leo be our permanent sensory design consultant. No one understands what works better than him." Richard smiled, watching his son, who was now approaching them, camera in hand, to show them a perfectly composed photograph of intersecting shadows. "I had already considered it," he replied. "In fact, it was his idea." Leo, oblivious to the conversation about his future role, extended the camera toward Eleanor, silently sharing his vision of the world. On the digital screen, the shadows formed patterns that resembled small bridges connecting different areas of the garden. Invisible bridges to most, but perfectly clear to those who knew how to truly look. That night, while Leo slept, and Richard reviewed the final project blueprints in his study, Eleanor paused in front of a framed photograph on the wall. It was an image of Miranda Vance holding baby Leo, both looking toward a horizon the camera did not capture. "Your vision is coming true," Eleanor thought, with a mixture of joy and melancholy, through paths neither of us would have imagined. Richard quietly entered the room, observing Eleanor standing before his late wife's portrait. "Sometimes I think she sent you somehow," he said, softly, "to remind me of what truly matters." Eleanor turned to him, moved by the vulnerability in his voice. "I think we just found each other at the right time," she replied, "when we were all ready to hear what had always been there." Richard nodded, understanding the depth of her words. The real bridge had not been the architectural project, but the human connection that had formed between them, between a father and his son, between a caregiver and a boy, between two adults united by a shared purpose. "The world is full of silent bridges," he murmured, repeating a phrase Eleanor had used months ago. "We just need to learn how to see them." The next morning, as the sun bathed the gardens of the Vance estate, Leo woke up early and went to his drawing table. With meticulous precision, he began to trace what would be his most personal contribution to the project, a sensory park where neurodivergent and neurotypical children could share experiences, each in their own way, each on their own terms. In silence, with the absolute concentration that characterized him, he drew bridges between different worlds, between distinct ways of being and perceiving. Bridges that, thanks to his father's renewed vision and Eleanor's intuitive understanding, would soon become a reality.